September 1943, at Rabaul Airfield, Japanese pilots stood at the peak of their confidence, believing they had already mastered the skies after nearly 2 years of unstoppable victories across the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected fighter pilots, read an intelligence report describing a new American aircraft called the Hellcat, and instead of laughter, he reacted with laughter because the specifications sounded completely wrong. According to the report, the Hellcat was almost twice as heavy as the Zero, larger in size, and built with armor and extra equipment, which to Japanese pilots meant it would be slow, clumsy, and easy to defeat in combat. At that time, Japanese air strategy was based on one core belief: a lighter and more maneuverable aircraft would always defeat a heavier one, and the Zero perfectly represented that philosophy with its unmatched turning ability and long range. For years, this belief had been proven correct, as Japanese pilots achieved incredible kill ratios in places like Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, destroying enemy aircraft with minimal losses of their own. The Zero felt almost like an extension of the pilot's body, allowing them to outmaneuver any opponent. And this created a dangerous level of confidence where Japanese pilots began to underestimate any new enemy technology. However, what they failed to understand was that the Zero's incredible performance came at a hidden cost. Because it lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and pilot protection, meaning even a few bullets could destroy it instantly. Despite this weakness, Japanese pilots ignored the risk because their enemies had not yet developed a system capable of exploiting it, which reinforced their belief that skill alone would always guarantee victory. Meanwhile, the Americans were not trying to copy the Zero, but instead were designing a completely different kind of fighter that focused on power, durability, and teamwork rather than pure maneuverability. The Hellcat was built with a powerful engine, heavy armor, 6 machine guns, and advanced communication systems, making it part of a larger combat strategy rather than just a single aircraft. When Japanese intelligence first reported these features, commanders dismissed them as proof that Americans did not understand aerial combat, assuming that such a heavy aircraft would never be able to compete with the agile Zero in a traditional dogfight. This overconfidence created a critical blind spot because Japanese pilots continued to train and fight using the same turning-based tactics, unaware that the nature of air combat was about to change completely. The first real encounter between the Zero and the Hellcat shocked Japanese pilots, as the American aircraft refused to engage in turning fights and instead used its superior speed and power to climb, dive, and attack from positions of advantage. Instead of chasing the Zero, the Hellcat attacked like a predator, striking quickly with overwhelming firepower and then climbing away before the Japanese pilot could respond, making traditional tactics useless. This new style of fighting, known as energy combat, completely disrupted Japanese strategy, as their aircraft could not match the Hellcat's power at higher altitudes or recover speed quickly enough after maneuvers. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots experienced a situation where their skill was not enough to save them, because they were no longer fighting individual pilots, but an entire system designed for maximum efficiency. The realization came too late, as more Hellcats began appearing in larger numbers, each one supported by radar guidance, coordinated tactics, and better trained pilots who worked together instead of fighting alone. What started as laughter at an intelligence report slowly turned to confusion, then fear, as Japanese pilots began to understand that they were facing something entirely different from anything they had encountered before. By the end of 1943, the balance of power in the Pacific skies had begun to shift, marking the beginning of a devastating transformation that would eventually destroy Japan's air superiority completely.
The turning point began in late 1943, when Japanese pilots started encountering the Hellcat more frequently and realized that this aircraft did not behave like anything they had fought before. During one of the early encounters near Marcus Island, a Japanese pilot spotted several incoming aircraft and initially mistook them for bombers because of their large size and heavy appearance. Confident in his Zero's superiority, he dived toward the enemy, expecting an easy victory, believing the heavier American aircraft would struggle to react quickly. However, instead of turning or fleeing, the Hellcat suddenly climbed upward with surprising speed, using its powerful engine to gain altitude in a way that completely shocked the Japanese pilot. As the Zero tried to follow, it began to lose speed and struggle against gravity, revealing a critical weakness when fighting in vertical maneuvers rather than horizontal turns. Within seconds, the situation reversed and the Hellcat repositioned itself above the Zero, turning from prey into predator in a way Japanese pilots had never experienced before. The American fighter then opened fire with 6 heavy machine guns, unleashing a volume of bullets far greater than anything the Japanese were used to facing in air combat. The Zero, lacking armor protection, was extremely vulnerable to this kind of firepower, and even a short burst could cause severe damage or destroy the aircraft entirely. Many Japanese pilots who survived these encounters reported that their planes were torn apart within seconds, leaving them with little chance to escape or counterattack. This marked the first realization that the Hellcat was not designed to compete in turning battles, but instead to dominate through speed, power, and positioning. Shortly after, during attacks on Wake Island, larger formations of Hellcats demonstrated a new kind of coordinated fighting style that further confused Japanese pilots. Instead of breaking formation and engaging individually, the Hellcats maintained discipline, flying in organized groups that supported each other during combat. When Japanese Zeros attempted to attack using traditional diving tactics, the Hellcats absorbed the initial attacks with their armor and continued flying without significant damage. Once the Japanese pilots lost their speed and positioning after their attack runs, the Hellcats counterattacked with devastating efficiency. They used their weight and engine power to climb rapidly, gaining altitude where the Zero's engine performance dropped significantly for lack of power at higher levels. From above, the Hellcats would dive down at high speed, fire a burst, and then climb back up again, repeating the process without ever giving the Zero a chance to engage properly. This method of fighting allowed the Americans to control the battle completely, choosing when to attack and when to disengage, something the Japanese pilots were not trained to handle. In one such engagement, multiple Japanese aircraft were shot down without a single Hellcat being lost, a result that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Reports from surviving Japanese pilots began to describe these encounters not as battles, but as one-sided attacks where they felt helpless against a superior system. The concept of air combat itself was changing, as the traditional idea of turning fights and individual skill was being replaced by coordinated tactics and energy management.
Japanese commanders initially struggled to understand these changes and continued to believe that their pilots could adapt using their existing skills and experience. However, the reality was far more dangerous because the Hellcat was not just an improved aircraft, but part of a completely new approach to warfare that combined technology, training, and teamwork.
American pilots used radios to communicate constantly during combat, allowing them to coordinate attacks, warn each other of danger, and maintain formation discipline.
Roger, braking right.
In contrast, many Japanese pilots operated with limited or no radio communication, relying on visual signals and individual decision-making, which made coordination extremely difficult. This difference meant that while Japanese pilots fought as individuals, the Americans fought as a unified system, multiplying their effectiveness in every engagement. As these encounters increased, the psychological impact on Japanese pilots became more noticeable, as confidence slowly turned into uncertainty and fear. Pilots who once believed they were invincible now faced an enemy that they could not outmaneuver, outrun, or outgun in most situations. The skies that once felt like a place of dominance were now becoming dangerous and unpredictable, with Hellcats appearing from unexpected directions and attacking with precision. By the end of 1943, it was becoming clear that the balance of power was shifting, and the Japanese Air Force was no longer in control of the skies. What had started as laughter at a heavy and flawed aircraft was now turning into a growing realization that they had underestimated something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. And this was only the beginning, because the true scale of destruction had not yet arrived.